My name is Diane Mercer, and I was the eldest daughter of the Mercer family, a name once whispered with respect in Seattle's real estate circles. The night my own family threw me out of our mansion, they erased my name from every document, every memory, every legacy I helped build. They said I didn't deserve to be a Mercer. For years, I lived with that humiliation until the day I saw my name again, not in their house but on every magazine cover their children now admire. They buried me in silence, but I came back louder than their entire empire. I never imagined that at 58 years old, I'd be told I no longer belonged to the family I had sacrificed everything for. For decades, Mercer Realty had been my life's work. I built it brick by brick alongside my parents and siblings, pouring every ounce of energy I had into it. I wasn't just an employee, I was the backbone no one ever credited. My parents always told me I was the responsible one, the dependable one. Those words used to make me proud. Now they feel like a curse that chained me to their ambitions while mine withered away. My younger sister, Claudia, was everything I wasn't. She had our father's confidence, his charm, and the looks that made people listen even when she had nothing important to say. She knew how to make people adore her. I, on the other hand, was the quiet one, the one who kept the books balanced, who stayed late, fixing mistakes others made, who never asked for recognition. My brother Ethan floated between us, never taking sides, though deep down I think he always envied Claudia's easy charm and my relentless discipline. We were a trio born from the same parents but driven by entirely different hearts. When our parents passed away within a year of each other, I was devastated. I had taken care of both of them in their final years, managing their finances and their care, while Claudia jetted around the country for business. I remember thinking that after everything I had done, they would finally see me, finally acknowledge my worth. But the will reading changed everything I believed about family. The lawyer, a man I'd known for decades, couldn't look me in the eye as he read out the words that shattered my world. My parents had left everything, the company, the estate, even the family heirlooms to Claudia and Ethan. My name wasn't even mentioned beyond a single sentence. To Diane, who has already been sufficiently compensated for her contributions. Compensated? I stared at that line, my chest tightening, my throat closing around a scream I couldn't release. I hadn't been compensated, I'd been used. I remember looking at Claudia that day. She didn't even flinch. She just smiled politely, as if I were a guest who had overstayed my welcome. Ethan avoided my gaze, pretending to shuffle papers in his lap. That was the moment I realized I was truly alone, not by fate, but by choice, theirs, not mine. In the weeks that followed, the humiliation continued in quiet, calculated ways. Claudia, now the CEO of Mercer Realty, held her first family meeting without inviting me. When I confronted her, she told me I made everyone uncomfortable and that it was best if I didn't attend future gatherings. Her tone was gentle, but her words were knives wrapped in silk. She said the company needed to move forward without the emotional baggage of the past. I was that baggage. Me, the woman who had built the company's foundation from nothing. Me, the sister who gave up her own dreams to keep theirs alive. The final blow came when I went to the Mercer estate to collect my personal belongings. My access card didn't work. A security guard, who once used to wave at me every morning, looked down as he escorted me in. I packed what little was left of my presence in that grand house, a few framed photos, a stack of old documents, and a plant that had withered near my desk. My niece Hannah, Claudia's daughter, stood in the hallway watching. She was only 12, her expression filled with confusion and guilt. She didn't understand why her aunt was leaving with a cardboard box while her mother stood in the background, arms folded, eyes cold. I smiled at Hannah as best as I could and told her to keep studying hard. But inside, something was breaking. As I stepped out into the rain, the sky seemed to share my grief. The Mercer mansion loomed behind me, lights glowing in every window, laughter echoing faintly through the walls I once called home. I stood there, soaked and trembling, realizing that I had been erased not just from their business, but from their story. My name would no longer appear on company documents, no longer be spoken at family dinners, no longer be remembered in the legacy I helped create. I was a ghost haunting the edges of my own bloodline. That night, I sat alone in my car, staring at the raindrops sliding down the windshield like tears I refused to shed. For the first time in my life, there was no plan, no next step. The world felt empty, stripped of purpose. Yet, beneath the ache of betrayal, a spark began to flicker, small, but steady. I realized that they could take everything from me, but they couldn't erase what I knew, what I had learned, or who I truly was. I had built an empire once, I could build again. And this time, I would build something that belonged to me and me alone. It was then that I made a silent promise to myself. I swore that someday, they would regret the day they threw me away. I didn't know how, and I didn't know when, but I knew I would rise again. I would make the name Diane Mercer mean something greater than theirs ever could. It wouldn't be about revenge in the cruel sense. It would be about justice, the kind that comes when truth quietly outshines deception. As I started my car and drove away, the mansion grew smaller in my rearview mirror. The rain, swallowing its golden glow, whispered to the darkness, "If my name means nothing to them now, one day it will mean everything." I didn't know that night that those words would become a prophecy. My story wasn't ending. It was only beginning. When you have nothing left to lose, you find strength you didn't know you had. That was the truth I woke up to each morning after being cast out of the Mercer family. My world had collapsed, and yet the silence that followed was strangely liberating. For the first time in years, no one was calling me for help. No one was depending on me to clean up their mistakes. I was free but frightened. I packed what was left of my belongings into a single suitcase and moved into a small rented apartment downtown. It wasn't much, but it was mine. The building was old, the walls thin, and the heat unreliable, but I found comfort in the simplicity of it. There were no portraits of family members staring down at me in judgment, no reminders of what I had lost. It was just me, the hum of the city outside my window, and the faint hope that maybe I could start again. In those early weeks, the pain was sharp. Every morning, I'd wake up expecting a call from Ethan or Claudia, thinking maybe they'd realized what they'd done. But the phone never rang. I had to stop myself from checking the Mercer Realty website, where my name had already been removed. The familiar ache of betrayal sat heavy in my chest, but I refused to let it swallow me whole. Instead, I filled my days with small acts of purpose, organizing my space, taking long walks through the rainy streets of Seattle, and reminding myself that I had survived worse storms before. Money, however, was a pressing concern. I had enough savings to get by for a few months, but that was it. I needed work, and fast. So I took the first job that came my way, a night position at a small property management firm on the outskirts of the city. It was ironic, really. I was doing the same kind of work I had once supervised others to do at Mercer Realty. Back then, I was the one giving instructions, not taking them. But humility can be a strange teacher. The office was small, with a staff of barely 6 people, and the pay wasn't much, but the work was honest. My boss, a sharp yet compassionate woman named Harriet Lowell, was nothing like my family. She noticed everything, especially the way I handled the complex cases no one else wanted. Harriet was in her early 60s, with silver hair always tied neatly in a bun and a voice that carried both authority and warmth. She once told me she could see that I was someone rebuilding from ashes. That struck a chord deep within me. Harriet didn't ask about my past, but she saw my potential long before I did. She began giving me more responsibility, client negotiations, project management, even training new hires. For the first time in a long while, I felt respected not because of my last name, but because of my work. One late evening, after everyone had gone home, Harriet stopped by my desk. She looked at me thoughtfully and said, "Diane, you've got something rare, a mind for detail and a heart that still cares about people. You should consider starting something of your own." The idea seemed absurd at first. I had barely scraped enough confidence together to make it through each day. Starting my own business? That felt like a dream meant for someone else. But Harriet planted a seed, and it grew quietly in the back of my mind. Over the next few months, I saved every extra dollar I could. I studied the market, identified gaps, and began crafting a plan for a business that would serve small property owners who couldn't afford the inflated rates of big firms. The irony didn't escape me when I chose the name Mercer and Beyond. The name was my declaration that I would no longer be bound by the family that cast me aside. I was taking what I had built with them and going beyond it, beyond their greed, beyond their arrogance, beyond their reach. Starting out was terrifying. My office was the kitchen table in my small apartment, my equipment, a secondhand laptop, and a printer that jammed every other day. My first client came from a chance encounter at a coffee shop, a local landlord struggling with mismanaged properties. I offered him a consultation for half the price others charged. Within weeks, his business was back on track, and he referred me to 2 more clients. Word spread quickly, not because I was flashy or famous, but because I cared. I answered calls late at night, treated each property as if it were my own, and really listened to the people who trusted me. That became my secret weapon. By the end of my first year, I had more clients than I could handle. The same people who once overlooked me were now seeking my advice. I started earning more money than I ever did under the Mercer name. There was a strange satisfaction in depositing each paycheck, knowing that every cent it was mine earned, not inherited. Still, the success wasn't just about finances, it was about reclaiming my identity. Each day I worked, I chipped away at the version of myself they tried to bury. One night, as I looked out from my apartment window, the city lights stretching endlessly before me, I realized something profound. The pain that once defined me had transformed into power. The betrayal that broke me had become the foundation of something stronger. I no longer needed the Mercer family's approval or acknowledgement. I was building a new legacy, one built on integrity and compassion, the very values they had abandoned. Then, one ordinary Tuesday afternoon, as I was reviewing client contracts at my desk, my phone rang. The number on the screen was unfamiliar, but the name that appeared on the caller ID stopped me cold. It was a name I hadn't seen in years, a name that stirred memories I thought I had buried. The voice on the other end introduced himself politely, explaining that he had heard of my company through a mutual contact and wanted to discuss hiring my services. My heart skipped a beat when he said his last name. Mercer. I sat there frozen, the irony washing over me like a wave. After all the years of silence, after all the pain of being cast out, it seemed fate wasn't done with me yet. As I ended the call and stared at my phone, I couldn't help but feel that this wasn't just another business opportunity. It was the first turn in a path that was leading me right back to the family who had erased me. Only this time, I wasn't coming as the forgotten sister. I was coming as someone they would never see coming, Diane Mercer, founder of Mercer and Beyond. And somewhere deep inside, beneath the calm surface of my new life, I felt it again, that spark. The story wasn't over. It was only beginning to unfold. Sometimes revenge begins with an innocent handshake. I remember the day that phone call came as clearly as if it happened, and yesterday. The man on the other end introduced himself as Adam Mercer, a name that instantly sent a chill through me. For a moment, I thought it might be a cruel joke, another reminder of the family that had erased me. But Adam quickly explained that he was a distant relative of the Mercer family by marriage. A college friend of my brother Ethan, who had recently inherited a failing property complex in the outskirts of Tacoma. He said he'd heard of my consultancy, Mercer and Beyond, through a mutual business contact. He spoke highly of my reputation, calling me the woman who helps people turn around lost causes. The irony wasn't lost on me. Without realizing it, Adam had just handed me an opportunity, an opening into the same world that had once shut its doors in my face. I agreed to meet him the following week. As I drove to the property, my thoughts wrestled with questions of morality and strategy. Should I reveal who I was? Should I admit that the Mercers he knew were the same ones who had disowned me? In the end, I decided against it. This wasn't deceit, it was strategy. I needed to understand how the Mercer name functioned in business circles without my involvement. More importantly, I wanted to see what kind of damage Claudia and Ethan had done to the empire we once built together. When I arrived at the property, a half-empty apartment complex surrounded by overgrown lawns and neglected maintenance, it felt symbolic. Everything the Mercers touched now seemed to be deteriorating from the inside out. Adam greeted me with a handshake, his tone respectful, his manner sincere. He had inherited the complex from an uncle who passed away and was desperate to make it profitable again. I walked through the property, inspecting the worn-out interiors, the leaking ceilings, the fading paint. As I took notes, a strange calm came over me. I was back in my element, doing what I did best, fixing things, rebuilding what others had abandoned. Over the next several months, I worked closely with Adam, developing a sustainable plan to revive the complex. I focused on practical renovations, honest marketing, and fair tenant policies, values my family's firm had long discarded in favor of profit. Slowly, the property began to change. New tenants moved in, the landscaping was restored, and the building regained its dignity. Adam was impressed by my work, and through him, I was introduced to a growing circle of investors, property owners, and managers across the state. These were people who had once done business with Mercer Realty but had grown tired of their arrogance and unethical practices. I listened to their frustrations quietly, never mentioning my family ties. Instead, I offered solutions transparent, affordable, and human. My approach was simple but effective, and soon my consultancy started attracting more attention than I had anticipated. It began with a few word-of-mouth referrals, then turned into local articles praising Mercer and Beyond as a company redefining integrity in real estate. Every mention of my name was a silent victory. Each success felt like reclaiming a stolen piece of my past. As my reputation grew, I began to notice familiar patterns. The same investors who once worshipped Claudia's charisma were now questioning her decisions. The same clients who praised Ethan's leadership were quietly transferring their business to me. I wasn't competing directly with them, I was simply being everything they weren't. People began describing me as the woman who does real estate differently. It was meant as a compliment, but to me, it was a declaration of independence. The first time I saw my company's name printed in a business magazine, I sat in stunned silence. There it was, Mercer and Beyond in bold letters, right beside an article criticizing Mercer Realty for poor ethics and mismanagement. I didn't gloat. I didn't celebrate. I simply felt something settle inside me, something steady and strong. My revenge wasn't about tearing them down. It was about rising so high that their betrayal no longer defined me. Still, I couldn't ignore the irony. The very name they had tried to erase was now the name people admired. My emails were flooded with inquiries, interview requests, and even offers from investors who wanted to partner with me. I declined most of them. I wasn't chasing power. I was chasing purpose. The only validation I needed came from knowing that every deal I closed, every client I helped, was one more reminder that the Mercer name no longer belonged to Claudia and Ethan alone. It belonged to me, and I was rewriting its meaning. Months later, I received an invitation that made me pause. It was for a major real estate conference in downtown Seattle, the kind of event where the biggest names in the industry gathered each year. I had attended countless times in the past, always as part of Mercer Realty's delegation, always in the background while Claudia basked in the spotlight. But this time, the invitation was addressed to me personally. Mercer and Beyond had been nominated for an award recognizing ethical leadership and innovation in property management. My chest tightened as I read the details. I was to be honored as one of the keynote speakers. The irony deepened when I noticed the event's main sponsor printed at the bottom of the invitation, Mercer Realty. For a moment, I simply stared at it, unsure whether to laugh or cry. It felt as though fate itself was orchestrating the confrontation I had avoided for years. The same company that had cut me out of its legacy was now paying to feature my name on their stage. In the days leading up to the conference, memories flooded back of meetings where I was silenced, of family dinners where my opinions were brushed aside, of nights spent poring over contracts while Claudia took credit for my work. I could feel the old anger rising, but I refused to let it consume me. This was not about vengeance born from bitterness. This was about justice delivered through grace. I wouldn't expose them or humiliate them. I would simply exist, fully and confidently, in the space they once denied me. On the morning of the conference, I stood before the mirror, adjusting my blazer. My reflection looked older, wiser, and unshakably calm. I thought about my mother's words, long ago. "You'll always be the steady one, Diane." She was right. Steady doesn't mean weak. It means enduring. It means surviving when others crumble. As I walked into the grand ballroom filled with hundreds of industry professionals, I felt every eye turn toward me. I took my place on stage, the spotlight warm against my skin. And when I glanced toward the front row, I saw them, Claudia and Ethan, sitting side by side, unaware that the keynote speaker about to take the stage was the sister they had erased. My heartbeat steadied, my resolve crystallized. I smiled as the resolve crystallized. Announcer took the microphone and said, "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our next speaker, Diane Mercer, founder of Mercer and Beyond." The applause that followed was thunderous, echoing through the hall like poetic justice. Fate has a twisted sense of humor, and that night, it put me on stage above the very people who had thrown me away. The grand ballroom was bathed in golden light, chandeliers gleaming over a sea of polished tables and murmuring conversations. I could feel the weight of hundreds of eyes scanning the event brochure, stopping at the words printed beside my photo, "Diane Mercer, founder, Mercer and Beyond." My pulse quickened as I walked through the lobby toward the conference hall, my heels clicking against the marble floor like quiet declarations of strength. Every step felt surreal. Years ago, I would have been here as part of the Mercer Realty delegation, arranging Claudia's schedule, managing Ethan's notes, and fading quietly into the background, while they basked in praise. But tonight, I was no one's shadow. I was the keynote speaker. As I entered the hall, my eyes caught sight of the Mercer Realty booth gleaming across the room. Their display was as ostentatious as ever, oversized banners, glossy photos, and fake smiles masking insecurity. Claudia stood at the center, dressed in her signature cream suit, commanding attention as she laughed with a group of executives. Ethan hovered nearby, trying to look confident but visibly distracted, his hair now peppered with gray. Neither of them noticed me at first, and for a fleeting moment, I simply watched them. It was strange seeing them through the lens of detachment, no longer as the sister they had betrayed, but as business rivals unaware that their reckoning was standing just a few feet away. I took my place near the stage, waiting for the host to announce the next segment. My presentation was scheduled under the theme, "Restoring Integrity in Real Estate Management," and the irony was poetic. Everything I was about to speak about the values of honesty, transparency, and respect were the very things Claudia and Ethan had trampled on in their pursuit of wealth. When the lights dimmed and the announcer's voice filled the room, my name echoed through the speakers. "Please welcome our next speaker, the founder of Mercer and Beyond, Miss Diane Mercer." The room stirred. I could feel a collective pause as people processed the name. The Mercer name was well known in the industry, but the Beyond attached to it added a layer of curiosity. As I walked to the stage, applause began to ripple across the hall. My eyes found Claudia's face in the crowd just as the large screen behind me lit up with my presentation title and my full name. The moment her gaze landed on it, her expression froze. Her smile faltered. Ethan's jaw tightened. I could almost hear the gears turning in their minds as they realized who I was, not a ghost from their past, but a living reminder of what they had tried to erase. Taking a steady breath, I began my presentation. My voice carried clearly through the microphone, calm and sure. I spoke about the importance of ethics in business, about how integrity builds trust, and how people remember those who treat them right long after the contracts are forgotten. I didn't mention the betrayal, the inheritance, or the years I spent rebuilding from nothing. I didn't need to. My very presence on that stage was its own statement. The crowd listened intently, nodding, taking notes. At moments, I could see subtle reactions from people who knew the Mercer name well. They were connecting the dots, realizing that there was a deeper story behind my success. When I finished, the applause was thunderous. It wasn't the polite clapping reserved for routine speeches. It was genuine, resonant, and filled with admiration. As I stepped down from the stage, I caught sight of Claudia's face again. Her usual poise had cracked, her eyes narrowed as she whispered something to Ethan. He looked stunned, his shoulders sinking under the realization that the sister they had deemed unworthy was now being celebrated for the very principles they had abandoned. Throughout the rest of the evening, people approached me to shake my hand, to thank me, to ask for consultations. Investors, property owners, even former clients of Mercer Realty came forward, expressing interest in working with Mercer and beyond. I answered each one warmly, my smile genuine yet composed. Every conversation felt like a silent triumph, a ripple of vindication spreading quietly through the room. I could see members of my family's firm in the distance, watching helplessly as I charmed the same network they once dominated. Later that night, as the crowd thinned and the music softened, I gathered my things from the green room. I was heading toward the exit when I saw Claudia walking toward me. Her heels clicked sharply against the floor, her expression a careful mask of composure. For a brief second, I almost believed she might apologize, that perhaps time and exposure had softened her pride. But as she stopped in front of me, I saw the same glint of superiority in her eyes, the same arrogance that had once dismissed my existence. "Diane," she said softly, as if testing how my name tasted on her tongue after all these years. I could see her rehearsed politeness, her attempt to reclaim control of the narrative. But before she could say another word, I smiled a calm, knowing smile and stepped around her. I didn't owe her a conversation. I didn't owe her closure. My silence was enough. It said everything she needed to hear. That I no longer lived in her shadow. That I didn't need her acknowledgement to exist. As I walked away, I felt lighter than I had in years. There was no bitterness left. Only the quiet satisfaction of victory earned through perseverance. My revenge wasn't loud or cruel. Dignity of my presence, in the applause of a room that once belonged to them, now echoing for me. That night, as I returned home and slipped off my shoes, I poured myself a glass of wine and watched the city lights shimmer outside my window. The conference had been more than a professional milestone, it was a reckoning. The world finally knew my name not as the forgotten Mercer, but as the one who redefined what it meant to be a Mercer at all. Still, a part of me sensed that this was only the beginning. Fame attracts attention, and stories like mine rarely stay contained. I knew there would be whispers, questions, and eventually, the truth would surface. But this time, I was ready for whatever came next. 2 days later, just as I was reviewing new client proposals, an email notification appeared on my screen. The subject line read, "Interview request, the forgotten Mercer." It was from a young journalist named Paige Rudd, who said she had followed my career and wanted to feature my story in her magazine. She wrote that the world deserved to know how I had built something extraordinary out of betrayal. As I read her message, a slow smile crept across my face. Fate wasn't done weaving its irony. The Mercer name that once symbolized exclusion was about to become a symbol of resilience, and the story of the woman they erased was about to be told to the world. The name they tried to erase was now appearing on magazine covers. I remember holding that glossy issue in my hands, my photo stretched across the front with the headline, "The Mercer Who Made It Without the Mercers." For a moment, I just stared at it, letting the words sink in. It felt surreal to see my name not attached to my family's shadow, but to my own story, one of perseverance, resilience, and quiet revenge. The journalist, Paige Rudd, had captured my journey with grace and honesty. She hadn't focused on bitterness or betrayal, but on transformation, on how a woman cast out by her own blood could rise again, stronger and truer than before. Paige had spent weeks interviewing me, listening carefully as I recounted the years of being unseen, the nights I'd spent rebuilding from nothing, and the small victories that eventually added up to something monumental. She told me that my story was the kind of truth people need right now. A reminder that it's never too late to rebuild. When the article went live online, it spread like wildfire. Within hours, my inbox was overflowing with messages, strangers from across the country writing to tell me that my journey had touched their lives. Some were women in their 50s and 60s, mothers, widows, and retirees who had been told they were too old to start over. Others were young professionals disillusioned by corporate greed, thanking me for showing that success built on integrity still mattered. The overwhelming support was humbling. I read every message I could, often with tears in my eyes. One woman wrote, "You gave me the courage to leave a job where I was invisible." Another said, "I'm naming my new business after my grandmother, because you reminded me that our names have power." Those words filled me with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt even during my most successful years at Mercer Realty. I realized that my story wasn't just mine anymore. It belonged to every person who had ever been overlooked, silenced, or underestimated. As the weeks went by, the effect of the article rippled through my professional world. New clients began reaching out not just from Seattle, but from across the country. Small business owners, community leaders, and property investors contacted Mercer and beyond, eager to work with the woman they'd read about. My schedule became a whirlwind of consultations, speaking invitations, and partnership offers. Even more astonishing were the job applications that began to arrive. Many came from people who worked for Mercer Realty. Some of the names were familiar: former assistants, accountants, and even mid-level managers who had once ignored my existence out of loyalty to Claudia and Ethan. Their messages were filled with humility, with phrases like, "I've always admired the way you handled yourself, and I want to be part of something that stands for integrity." I didn't hire them out of spite or sentiment. I hired them because I believed in second chances, something my family had never believed in for me. Within months, Mercer and Beyond grew from a small consultancy into a thriving agency with a dedicated team that shared my values. We expanded into new markets, focusing on fair housing, community projects, and ethical development. I made sure our policies reflected everything I had once been denied: fairness, transparency, and respect. Page's article had also sparked a conversation beyond business. Social media was buzzing with discussions about women reinventing themselves later in life, about age not being a barrier to ambition. I started receiving invitations to speak at women's leadership events, universities, and industry panels. Each time I stood before an audience, I spoke not about revenge, but about rediscovery, about turning pain into fuel for purpose. It was during one of those events that the idea struck me to launch a series of seminars under my brand. I called them Beyond Boundaries, programs designed to teach ethical entrepreneurship and personal reinvention. The first seminar sold out within days. Women flew in from different states to attend, eager to learn, to grow, to be seen. Standing before them, I felt an energy unlike anything I'd experienced before, a collective heartbeat of people determined to change their lives. That night, as I watched attendees share stories of courage and loss, I realized that my journey had transcended revenge. It had become a movement. Of course, success has a way of reaching the ears of those who least deserve to hear it. It didn't take long before Claudia tried to reinsert herself into my narrative. One morning, I woke to find a press release issued by Mercer Realty, congratulating me on my recent achievements and calling me a valued member of the extended Mercer legacy. I laughed when I read it. The tone was painfully insincere, dripping with the same arrogance I remembered from years ago. It wasn't a gesture of goodwill, it was an attempt to reclaim association with a name they'd once discarded. I ignored it. My silence, as always, spoke louder than any response could. The public saw through the statement easily. Commenters online called out the hypocrisy, praising me for standing on my own while mocking Mercer Realty for their sudden interest in reconciliation. Even the business community began to shift its perception. The Mercer name no longer evoked images of Claudia's empire but of my integrity, my brand, my story. For the first time, when people said, "Mercer," they weren't talking about the company that betrayed me. They were talking about the woman who rebuilt herself after being erased. That realization hit me deeply one afternoon as I walked through downtown Seattle. I passed by a newsstand displaying multiple magazines, and my name appeared on two of them. One headline read, "The Mercer Who Changed the Rules," and another said, "Integrity Reimagined. The Rise of Diane Mercer." I stood there for a moment, surrounded by the city's bustle, letting it sink in. The same name that had once been stripped of value was now shining brighter than ever. I thought about my parents then, about how proud they might have been if they'd lived to see this version of me. Maybe, in their own flawed way, They had believed Claudia and Ethan would protect the family's name. But I had been the one to truly honor it. Still, beneath all the success, there lingered a quiet ache, not of anger, but of reflection. I had found peace. But the scars of betrayal never fully fade. They become part of you. A map of lessons learned and strength earned. And though I never sought their validation again, a small part of me wondered if my siblings saw the world shifting around them, if they understood that the legacy they tried to bury had grown roots far beyond their reach. Then one afternoon, as I sat at my desk reviewing plans for our next seminar, an email notification appeared on my screen. The subject line was simple. "You don't know me, but I admire you." I opened it to find a message from a young girl who said she was a high school student. Her words were heartfelt, shaky with emotion. "My mom works for your sister," she wrote. "But I admire you more. You make me believe I can be more than what people expect of me." I leaned back in my chair, reading those words again and again. The irony was almost too perfect. The children of the very family that had thrown me away were beginning to see the truth for themselves. It wasn't bitterness that filled me then. It was grace. The kind that comes when you realize you've already won in the quietest, most meaningful way possible. I never expected the next generation of Mercers to come knocking at my door. It began with an email, simple, polite, and unassuming. The sender's name made my heart skip. Hannah Mercer. I hadn't seen it written out since the day I was escorted from the Mercer estate all those years ago, carrying a box of my things while she stood in the hallway watching. Too young to understand what was happening. Now, her message was short but deliberate. She said she wanted to meet me privately. She mentioned that she admired my work and that she didn't agree with the way her mother, Claudia, treated people. I sat at my desk, staring at the screen for several minutes, torn between curiosity and disbelief. Could this really be the same little girl whose confused eyes followed me into the rain that night? We arranged to meet the next afternoon at a quiet cafe downtown. I arrived early, sipping tea by the window while my thoughts drifted through memories I thought I'd buried. When Hannah walked in, I almost didn't recognize her. She was in her 20s now, elegant but understated, her resemblance to Claudia unmistakable, the same sharp cheekbones, the same confident stride. Yet there was something softer in her, something more genuine. When she spotted me, she smiled with a mixture of nervousness and warmth, the way someone smiles at a person they've known only through stories. "Aunt Diane," she said, her voice trembling slightly as she sat down. The words struck me deeply. No one had called me that in decades. She told me she had been following my work online for years, attending my seminars under a different name to avoid her mother's suspicion. She said she admired how I carried myself calm, composed, unshakable. "You've built something meaningful," she said, her eyes glistening. "Something I want to be part of." Hearing that, I felt an emotion I hadn't experienced in a long time. Pride, not for myself, but for her courage. Hannah confessed that she no longer respected the way her mother ran the company. "She treats people like tools," she said softly, glancing around to be sure no one could hear. "But you treat people like people. Everyone my age sees that. My friends talk about you all the time, about your seminars, your interviews. They say you're what a Mercer should be." Her words hit me with quiet force. All the years of pain, of silence, of erasure they were dissolving in that moment. The younger generation, untainted by greed, was seeing the truth for themselves. I listened carefully as she spoke, never interrupting, though my heart swelled with emotion. She wanted advice, not money, not connections, just wisdom. She was studying business management and dreamed of building a company focused on sustainable housing. I could see the same fire in her eyes that I once had when I first entered the industry, before pride and betrayal distorted everything. That spark reminded me of who I was before my family's ambition consumed me. In the days that followed, Hannah and I met several times. We talked about business, ethics, and even forgiveness. She told me that her brother, Evan, secretly admired my work too, though he was too afraid to admit it openly. I didn't encourage rebellion. That wasn't my goal. I simply told her that integrity would always outlast power built on deceit. She took notes, eager and bright, asking thoughtful questions that made me see how differently this generation viewed the world. For them, respect wasn't inherited, it was earned. Not long after, another message arrived, this one from Cole Mercer, Ethan's son. He had just graduated from college and wanted career advice. He wrote that he'd followed my journey and admired how I had turned adversity into strength. He didn't ask for a job, he only asked for guidance. We spoke over video call, and I was struck by his humility. He said, "Dad always told us not to bring up your name, but I don't see why. You're the only one in the family who's actually built something real." His honesty disarmed me. I realized then that my quiet revenge had become something far greater than I had ever intended. It was no longer about retribution, it was about restoration. The Mercer legacy, once poisoned by greed, was being redeemed through the hearts of their children. Word of my mentorships began to spread, though discreetly. I started receiving anonymous messages of gratitude from young professionals who had grown up under the Mercer shadow but found inspiration in my path. They said my story gave them hope that they could create success on their own terms with kindness, not cruelty. It was poetic justice in its purest form. My name, once buried under the weight of exclusion, was now the beacon they looked to for guidance. Meanwhile, Claudia was beginning to feel the cracks forming beneath her empire. Mercer Realty's public image had been slipping since my rise, and now the younger employees, many of them inspired by Hannah and Cole, were questioning the company's ethics. Clients began comparing their rigid, self-serving practices with the empathy-driven model of Mercer and beyond. The shift was subtle but undeniable. Claudia could no longer control the narrative, and she knew it. I started hearing through industry chatter that she was growing restless, even paranoid. She refused to acknowledge me publicly but complained to colleagues that I was exploiting the family name. The irony of that accusation wasn't lost on me. She was the one who had stripped me of the Mercer identity years ago, and now she was angry that I had reclaimed it not through power or manipulation, but through integrity. Then, one morning, as I sat in my office reviewing plans for a new mentoring program, my assistant handed me a letter. The thick envelope bore the unmistakable stamp of a law firm. I opened it, my heart steady, my mind calm. Inside was a notice of legal action, Claudia Mercer versus Diane Mercer. She was accusing me of defamation and brand theft. I read the words slowly, feeling an odd sense of déjà vu. Once again, Claudia was trying to erase me. But this time, the world was watching. I leaned back in my chair and smiled faintly. There was a time when something like this would have broken me, when the thought of standing against my family would have filled me with fear. But that version of me was long gone. I wasn't the frightened woman carrying boxes out of the family estate anymore. I was the woman who had built her own empire from the ashes of betrayal, who had inspired the very children they were raising. As I placed the letter down on my desk, I thought about Hannah and Cole, about how they had come to me not for revenge, but for truth. I realized that the lawsuit wasn't a setback. It was a sign that Claudia was losing control. She was desperate to hold on to a legacy that no longer belonged to her. And as I looked out my window at the city skyline that had once seemed so intimidating, I whispered to myself, "Let her come." Because, deep down, I already knew how this battle would end, not in the courtroom, but in the hearts of everyone watching. They dragged me to court, thinking they'd finally destroy me, but they forgot who taught them everything they knew. The lawsuit was barely filed before the headlines exploded. It was the perfect storm of family drama and corporate scandal, the kind of story journalists loved. Sister versus sister, the Mercer feud goes public. I watched it all unfold with an eerie sense of calm. While Claudia and her team unleashed their legal firepower, painting me as a manipulative opportunist who had stolen the Mercer identity, I was quietly gathering my truth, a truth she had conveniently hoped would stay buried. Years of documents, contracts, and invoices that bore my name but not my recognition had been sitting in boxes in my storage unit, waiting for this moment. Every late-night memo, every business plan, every client deal I had managed under Mercer Realty's banner was now evidence proof that I wasn't just a background figure, but the foundation of the company itself. I worked with my attorney, a measured and brilliant woman named Karen Monroe, who understood my case not as a fight for money, but as a fight for validation. Together, we built a case that wasn't emotional, but factual, an unshakable timeline of my contributions, my labor, and the betrayal that followed. When the court date finally arrived, Seattle's courthouse was buzzing with cameras and microphones. Reporters clustered outside the doors, speculating about whether the Mercer family name would survive the scandal. I arrived early, wearing a simple navy suit, nothing flashy, nothing performative. My power wasn't in appearance anymore, it was in truth. Inside the courtroom, the air was thick with tension. On one side sat Claudia and her legal team, sleek and smug. On the other, I sat quietly with Karen. My hands folded, my expression unreadable. Ethan was not present that first day. His absence spoke volumes. Claudia's argument was predictable. She claimed that Mercer and Beyond was a direct attempt to profit off the family brand, accusing me of defamation for misrepresenting my history. She even had the audacity to suggest that my success was due to her mentorship. Listening to her spin the narrative was like watching a stranger wear my life as a costume. But I didn't react. I had learned long ago that silence unnerves people more than anger ever could. When it was our turn to present evidence, Karen stood with quiet authority and began laying out the timeline. She displayed documents showing years of my unpaid consulting work, records of my strategic involvement in Mercer Realty's early projects, and emails proving my family had relied on my expertise long before Claudia ever took charge. With each piece of evidence, Claudia's confidence cracked slightly. I could see her fidgeting, her composure slipping as Karen methodically dismantled the lies she had built her empire on. Then came the moment I had both dreaded and anticipated, my turn to take the stand. As I walked up, the cameras outside flashed in my mind like ghosts, but the courtroom itself fell silent. I took the oath, adjusted the microphone, and looked at the jury, 12 strangers who would soon hold my truth in their hands. "I'm not here to destroy anyone," I began. "I'm here to reclaim what was taken from me, not the money, but the acknowledgement of the years I gave to build something I believed in." My voice didn't shake. I told them how I had managed projects, negotiated deals, and worked without proper compensation because I trusted my family to do what was right. I described the day I was told I no longer belonged, the humiliation of being cut off from my own legacy. I didn't embellish or dramatize, I simply told the truth, and the truth was powerful enough on its own. As I spoke, I noticed members of the jury exchange glances. Their faces softened, their expressions shifting from skepticism to quiet outrage. The human story beneath the corporate jargon was beginning to show. I wasn't the villain Claudia had painted me to be. I was the woman who had been erased. When Claudia took the stand, she tried to regain control with her signature charm, speaking about family misunderstandings and business miscommunications. But it was too late. Her tone, rehearsed and hollow, contrasted sharply with the authenticity they had seen in me. The jury could see through the facade, the calculated pauses, the crocodile tears. For once, her charisma was working against her. After weeks of testimony, evidence, and cross-examinations, the trial reached its end. The courtroom was packed the day the verdict was read. Even from where I sat, I could hear the reporters whispering, their pens poised, their cameras ready. My heart pounded in my chest, not out of fear, but anticipation. The judge's voice filled the room, calm and deliberate, as he summarized the case. Then came the words I had waited decades to hear. The court recognized my substantial contributions to the creation and success of Mercer Realty. The verdict was in my favor. The judge ordered Claudia to pay damages and to issue a formal public acknowledgement of my involvement in the company's foundation. But the monetary reward didn't matter to me. What mattered was the principle, the validation that the work of my hands, the years of my life, finally meant something again. For the first time, the truth was on record. It could never be erased. The courtroom erupted into murmurs as reporters scribbled frantically. The phrase spread quickly, "The forgotten Mercer wins." Within hours, it was all over the news headlines, interviews, op-eds celebrating the poetic justice of it all. I had become the symbol of perseverance once again, not because of what I gained, but because of what I stood for. I didn't just win a case, I reclaimed my name. Claudia sat frozen, her face pale and rigid. She didn't look at me as she gathered her papers, her hands trembling slightly. When she finally rose and walked out, the sound of her heels echoed in the silence she left behind, sharp, brittle, fading fast. I didn't gloat, I didn't even smile. Watching her retreat was enough. Her empire, built on deceit, was beginning to crumble not from my actions, but from the weight of its own corruption. Outside the courthouse, cameras flashed, and microphones reached toward me. "Miss Mercer, do you have any words for your family?" one reporter shouted. I paused before responding, my voice steady. "Sometimes, the truth takes time to find its way home," I said. Then I turned and walked away, the autumn wind cool against my face. That night, I returned to my apartment, exhausted but at peace. The city lights outside shimmered like 1,000 tiny promises. I made myself a cup of tea, sat at my desk, and opened my laptop to check the flood of messages from supporters. Among them, one new email caught my attention. It was from Ethan. After years of silence, the brother who had once looked away when I was erased had finally reached out. My hand hovered over the mouse, my heart both guarded and curious. Whatever this message contained, apology, explanation, or confession, I knew it would change everything again. After decades of silence, the brother who betrayed me reached out, and what he said changed everything. When I saw Ethan's name in my inbox that night, I froze. For a long moment, I simply stared at the screen, unsure whether I wanted to open it. There were too many memories attached to that name: childhood laughter, teenage loyalty, and the moment he turned his back on me during the reading of our parents' will. My hand trembled slightly as I clicked to open the message. What unfolded before me was not anger or accusation, but something far heavier: remorse. The email was long, every paragraph a confession. Ethan began by acknowledging what he had done. He said he'd spent years convincing himself that cutting me out had been necessary for the business, that Claudia had been right about me being too emotional to lead. But watching the trial, he wrote, had shattered those illusions. "I saw the truth in that courtroom," he said. "You didn't destroy the family name, Diane, you saved what was left of it." He admitted that Claudia had manipulated our parents during their final years, convincing them that I didn't need to be part of the inheritance. According to him, she'd insisted that leaving everything to her and him would streamline operations, and our parents, weary and ill, had given in. "I let her lead me," he wrote, "and I've hated myself for it ever since." He went on to describe how things had unraveled since then. Claudia's empire was crumbling. Clients had abandoned her company after the lawsuit, and trusted employees were leaving for firms that valued ethics, some even joining mine. "She's become paranoid," Ethan wrote. "She blames everyone but herself." He said he'd watched helplessly as the company that once represented their pride was now little more than a hollow shell of greed and ego. He didn't want to reconcile for business reasons. He said he just wanted to look me in the eye and apologize. Not to fix what's broken, he ended, but to acknowledge what should never have been broken in the first place. I read his message twice before closing my laptop. The part of me that had longed for an apology was moved, but another part remained cautious. Words could be easy, truth was harder. Yet, something about his tone, stripped of pride, raw with guilt, made me believe him. After all these years, maybe it was time to confront not just the pain, but what came after it. I replied with a simple message: "Tomorrow, noon, Corner Cafe." When I arrived, he was already there, sitting at a corner table with his hands clasped around a mug of untouched coffee. He looked older than I remembered. His hair, once dark and thick, was silver now, and his posture carried the weight of years spent in regret. As I approached, he stood, his eyes flickering with uncertainty. "Diane," he said quietly, his voice cracking. For a moment, we both stood there, neither knowing how to bridge the distance time had carved between us. We sat down, and for a while, we just talked, not as adversaries or estranged siblings, but as two people trying to make sense of what had happened. Ethan admitted that he had known Claudia was wrong but didn't have the courage to stand up to her. She always had a way of making you feel small, he said, looking down at his hands. I thought siding with her would keep the peace. I didn't realize I was losing my sister in the process. There was a tremor in his voice, a vulnerability that felt unfamiliar yet sincere. I listened quietly, the old anger inside me softening into something closer to understanding. When he finally said, "I'm sorry," it wasn't the kind of apology meant to erase the past, it was one that acknowledged its permanence. I told him I forgave him, not because I had forgotten, but because holding on to resentment would only keep me tied to a version of myself I no longer was. "I'm not forgiving you for you," I said gently. "I'm forgiving you for me." He nodded, his eyes glistening, and for the first time in decades, we shared a silence that wasn't heavy with bitterness but with relief. As our conversation went on, Ethan revealed more about Claudia's downfall. She had lost several key investors after the verdict. The firm's public reputation was in ruins, and employees were fleeing faster than she could replace them. "She still blames you," he said, shaking his head. "She says you humiliated her." I smiled faintly at that. "No," I replied. "She humiliated herself. I just stopped hiding it." He chuckled softly, a sound that felt both strange and familiar. It wasn't triumph I felt in that moment. It was closure. Before we left, Ethan reached across the table, his hand trembling slightly as it brushed mine. "Our children look up to you now, Diane," he said. "You're what the Mercer name should have been." Those words caught me off guard. I had never sought to replace anyone, but knowing that the next generation saw value in honesty and compassion meant everything. I squeezed his hand lightly and said, "Then maybe something good came out of all this after all." We parted outside the cafe under a soft drizzle. The air smelled of rain and redemption. Ethan hugged me before we said goodbye, and for a fleeting moment, it felt like the brother I had once known was back, not the man shaped by greed, but the one who used to sneak me cookies after dinner and defend me when Claudia mocked me. As he walked away, I realized that peace doesn't always come from justice or revenge. Sometimes it comes from understanding the brokenness in others and deciding not to let it break you too. That evening, I sat by the window of my apartment, the city glowing beneath the misty night. I replayed our conversation in my mind, the sincerity in his eyes, the relief in his voice. I knew things could never return to what they once were, but that wasn't the goal. The goal was healing. And in some quiet, unspoken way, we had both found it, just as I began to close my laptop for the night. Another email notification appeared. The sender's name made my breath catch. It wasn't Ethan this time. It was Hannah. The subject line read, "You should see this." I opened the message to find a scanned invitation attached. The golden lettering was unmistakable, the annual Mercer family reunion. I stared at it for a long moment, feeling a rush of emotions I couldn't name. After all these years of exile, after building a life entirely my own, the family that had erased me was calling me back. I didn't know why or what awaited me there, but I knew one thing. The story of Diane Mercer and the family who cast her aside wasn't quite over yet. Returning to the family that once threw me out was the final chapter I never knew I needed. The invitation from Hannah sat on my desk for days, the golden lettering glinting softly under the light whenever I walked past it. I must have read it 100 times. My mind tugged in two directions, one part of me still haunted by the memory of being told I no longer belonged, and another part whispering that maybe it was time to face what was left of the Mercer family. The invitation wasn't from Claudia, which made all the difference. It was from Hannah. She had written in her message that the reunion committee made up mostly of the younger Mercers wanted me there as an honored guest. The words honored guest struck something deep within me. I had once been erased, and now I was being invited back as a symbol of what the family name stood for. Still, I hesitated. Old wounds can feel fresh when revisited, and part of me feared that stepping back into their world would undo the peace I'd built. But closure is a peculiar thing it calls to you, even when you think you've moved on. So, on a cool autumn evening, I found myself standing outside the grand hall where the annual Mercer reunion was being held. The building glowed from within, laughter and music, spilling softly through the open doors. For a moment, I stood frozen at the threshold. My reflection caught in the glass, older, wiser, and stronger than the woman who once left this family behind in tears. I took a deep breath and walked inside. The moment I entered, the room fell into a hush. Conversations paused, and heads turned. I could feel hundreds of eyes on me, some surprised, some uncertain, and others filled with recognition. I straightened my shoulders, my heart calm despite the weight of the moment. The first to move toward me wasn't Claudia or Ethan. It was Hannah. She broke away from a small crowd and ran to me, her eyes bright with pride. "You came," she said softly. And for the first time, I saw her not as my niece but as the embodiment of everything I had hoped the next generation would become: strong, empathetic, unafraid of truth. Soon, others followed. One by one, the younger Mercers, the children and grandchildren who had grown up hearing the family's fractured history approached me with smiles and gratitude. "You're the reason I went into business," one young woman said. "Your story inspired my senior thesis," another added. I felt overwhelmed by the sincerity in their voices. These were the descendants of those who had once cast me out, yet they spoke to me not as an outcast but as an icon. The irony was breathtaking. My quiet redemption had grown beyond me. It had reshaped what the Mercer name meant to them. As the evening went on, I noticed a display at the far end of the hall labeled "The Mercer Legacy." It featured portraits and artifacts from generations of the family's history. Sepia-toned photographs of our great-grandparents, framed newspaper clippings about the early days of Mercer Realty, and then, to my astonishment, a new addition, a photograph of me. It was a candid shot from the court trial, me standing outside the courthouse surrounded by supporters, calm and dignified. Beneath it was a small plaque that read, "Diane Mercer, the woman who rebuilt integrity." My breath caught. I stood there, unable to move for a moment, the weight of it pressing gently against my chest. I had spent years trying to reclaim my name, and here it was not only restored, but honored. Tears welled in my eyes, not of sadness, but of gratitude. Across the room, I spotted Ethan standing near the refreshments table, watching me with a quiet smile. He gave me a small nod, a gesture of acknowledgement, of understanding. But my gaze soon shifted to the corner of the hall, where Claudia stood alone. She was still beautiful, but the years had carved lines of strain across her face. Her posture, once commanding, now seemed uncertain. She didn't approach, and I didn't expect her to. Our eyes met briefly across the room, a silent exchange filled with history and finality. There was no anger left in me, no desire to see her humbled. Her isolation was its own reckoning. The woman, who once believed power defined worth, now stood alone while I was surrounded by the very people she once sought to control. Later in the evening, one of the organizers invited me to say a few words. I hesitated, glancing at the expectant faces around me. But then I stepped up to the small stage. The microphone felt cool in my hands, and for a moment, the room was silent. "I wasn't sure I would ever attend another Mercer reunion," I began. "There was a time when this name caused me nothing but pain. But tonight, seeing all of you, seeing how far this family has come, I realized something important." I paused, my voice steady but full of emotion. Family isn't defined by inheritance or wealth. It's defined by respect, kindness, and the courage to do what's right. We can't change the mistakes of the past, but we can decide what kind of legacy we leave behind. The room erupted into applause. It wasn't thunderous or performative, it was warm, genuine, filled with understanding. I stepped down from the stage, and as people came forward to shake my hand, I saw pride and admiration in their eyes. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about redemption for me, and for them. The Mercer name, once tainted by greed and betrayal, was slowly healing, and in some way, I had become the bridge that made that possible. As the night wound down, I took one last look around the hall. Laughter filled the air again, the kind that sounded unforced and real. Hannah was chatting animatedly with Cole and Ethan, while Claudia remained in her corner, her expression unreadable. I didn't approach her. there was nothing left to say. Forgiveness had already happened in its own quiet way, not through words, but through transformation. When I finally stepped outside, the cool night air greeted me like an old friend. The Seattle skyline glittered in the distance, the city that had once been both my battlefield and my sanctuary. I walked to my car, slowly, taking in the stillness of the moment. The wind rustled the autumn leaves along the sidewalk, and I felt an inexplicable sense of peace wash over me. I had come full circle from being disowned and erased to standing as the embodiment of everything my family name should have represented all along. As I drove home beneath the cascade of city lights, I thought about the path that had led me here, every betrayal, every tear, every moment of solitude that had shaped me into the woman I had become. I realized that the sweetest revenge was never about watching others fall. It was about rising so high that their cruelty could no longer touch you. That night, as the lights of Seattle blurred past my window, I whispered to myself, "You did it, Diane. Not in triumph, but in peace." Because in the end, I hadn't just survived, I had transcended. And the Mercer name, once used to cast me out, now carried my story in every corner of its legacy, a legacy they could never erase. In the end, I realized revenge was never about making them suffer, it was about proving that integrity outlives cruelty. They took my name to destroy me, but I rebuilt it into something they could only dream of becoming. The Mercer legacy no longer belongs to greed or pride, it belongs to truth, to resilience, and to me. I walked away from their world long ago, but somehow, I became the compass their children now follow. And that, I've learned, is the kind of victory that doesn't just end a story, it defines it. If my story touched your heart, then maybe it's time more women like us remind the world that dignity never fades with age. Share this story so someone who's been silenced remembers her voice still matters. And before you go, tell me one thing in the comments. Have you ever been underestimated by the people you loved most, only to rise higher than they ever imagined?